just yell.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, let me check that.
So compromising at all.
Grab that. Thank you very much. Okay, everybody. Oh, thank you. Welcome. Thank you for being here on your Friday afternoon. Precious, precious Fridays with mediocre weather. I'd like to welcome Dr. Ailey Cage from the University of Stirling, who's here to talk about some research that we've been pursuing in our own way. So we have a lot of shared interests and future collaborations already that I've committed her to, persuaded her to. So we're going to talk about the autistic experience in higher education, a bit of camouflaging, and the effect of first impressions on successful completion. So I'll let you take it away.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invite and for having me. Let me just get set up. I have recently started at Stirling in January. Before that, I was down at Royal Holloway, part of University of London. So I'm here to kind of talk. Most of the research here was done down there, but I've got three kind of main projects I'm going to tell you about today, and hopefully have a few kind of take-home bits of advice about supporting autistic students. I'm starting though with our key points, a few spoilers about what I've actually found. So it looks like autistic students are more likely to drop out of uni, and some of this is related to difficulties with the transition to uni, as well as difficulties with fitting into the university community, and also difficulties with academic study, so things like independent study. Related to this, we know there's a lot of systemic barriers out there in society that affect autistic people, and in my research, my participants really talked about how these systemic issues have affected their university experiences. So things like diagnostic barriers, especially for autistic women, and also lack of autism understanding in the general public and how that affects their experiences at uni. Separate research looked more at this camouflaging, and I'll explain all about camouflaging later on. And I've found that autistic women report that they're more likely to camouflage in kind of settings like the workplace or at university. And so obviously that has implications for our work at uni. And also in terms of first impressions, so when you first meet someone, you form rapid judgments of them. Research has shown that more negative judgments are made of autistic people, but my research also looked at this in terms of gender and found that, of course, perhaps unsurprisingly, that gender does influence the first impressions that are formed, and that operates in terms of diagnosis as well. But I'll explain all as I go on. So in terms of autistic people in higher education, so I'm assuming that you're here because you have maybe an interest in autism, so you know what autism is. But just to clarify, it's a neurodevelopmental condition which affects the way autistic people see and perceive the world around them. And in higher education, the characteristics of autism can lead to both strengths and difficulties within university. So, for example, the social communication and social interaction difficulties, that might impact on things like group work, which is often prescribed as part of a course. On the other hand, there are lots of social opportunities for autistic people at university because they might be able to meet more like-minded people, join societies of topics which are focused interests of theirs. So there can also be lots of social benefits too. Then in terms of the kind of focused interests, that can mean that they've got brilliant attention to detail, which can really help with studying, or they might be able to study a topic that they're really passionate about. And there can often be a preference for routine, which, can sometimes mean that it'll be difficult in the academic environment where we often have quite unstructured ways of doing things. It's not like school where it's like you've got a clear structure throughout the whole day. So that can sometimes be quite challenging. But autistic people are more than capable of studying at university and graduating. And we are seeing a large increase in the number of students who are reporting that they're autistic at university. Now, I say that because there's probably a lot more out there who are not reporting it to the university, so they're not recorded officially in the higher education statistics. But you can see in this graph, back in 2009, 2010, only about 1,000 autistic students recorded in the first year of study. And fast forward to 2017-18, there's now almost 5,000 in just first year. And overall, at the moment, I think there's around 14,000 across all years and levels of study. So that is just the people who have disclosed and reported that they're autistic. As I say, there's likely to be lots who are maybe late diagnosed. They don't know that they're autistic yet or haven't been able to access a diagnosis. But what we see as well, unfortunately, is that a high number of autistic students are not able to complete their studies and they're dropping out. And there's actually been very little research trying to understand why this is the case. So along I've come and tried to research understanding why there might be a higher risk of non-completion for autistic students. So in this research, we've done two parts to it. So the first part was exploratory survey, trying to understand some of the different factors that might relate to the risk of dropping out. And then the second part was a qualitative interview study. So for this first part and the survey, we looked at different possible factors. So the first thing we were trying to look at to see how it might predict non-completion was looking at diagnosis and disclosure. Because you might predict if you are late diagnosed, you might have less access to support, and therefore maybe you're at higher risk of dropping out because you're not getting the support you need. Similarly, you might predict if you haven't disclosed, again, that will impact on accessing of support, and again, that might impact on the risk of dropout. Then your academic experiences, so maybe elements of not enjoying your course, or maybe just finding it really hard to study at uni, being dissatisfied with your grades. Those kind of academic experiences could all mean that you feel, I'm not happy with how I'm doing here, maybe dropping out is what I want to do. Then your social experiences, so fitting in at the university, feeling part of the university community, feeling lonely at uni, all those kind of factors could impact on the risk of dropout. Your mental well-being. So we know, unfortunately, that autistic people experience mental health problems at a much higher rate than non-autistic people. So perhaps some of those mental health problems could be exacerbated at university and could link then to dropout. We know as well autism, part of the characteristics of autism are differences in sensory experiences, and so you may find the university environment too much in a sensory sense. So like the fluorescent lighting can often be quite unpleasant for some autistic people, or just the noise and the movement on campus. All those kind of sensory elements could just make it too overwhelming. And then finally, we were also interested in the transition to uni, because you might expect that if you have a negative transition experience, so going from school or college or somewhere else to uni, if that doesn't go so well, that initial transition, you might end up feeling like everything else, it knocks on and affects all the other parts of your experience. So you're not feeling settled in, and you decide, I'd rather withdraw than continue these studies. So we looked at these 6 different areas and kind of measured them quantitatively, and we had 230 autistic adults complete a survey on these different factors. Within this, some had graduated, so we had 151 who had graduated on the first time. Then we had 34 people who had graduated after several attempts. So I decided to look at this group separately because they have that experience of dropping out of uni, but then reapplying and then managing to graduate. And then we had 45 people who had not completed. So obviously those groups are quite small in size, but seeing as there's a total lack of research on this topic, it's still, I think, a good start for trying to explore and understand what might be going on here. And in terms of the kind of characteristics, there were more females in the sample. mean age about 33, and most, but not all, have studied in the UK. But I did make sure that I took these different demographics into account in my analyses. So in terms of key findings, so there were three kind of main areas that related to the risk of dropout. So first of all, the transition to university. So those who did not complete found the transition itself more difficult, and they reported a more negative transition experience. So that first initial few months and weeks of going to uni was more challenging for this group of students who had dropped out. Then in terms of academic experiences, again, this group of people who didn't complete their studies reported that they had had a poorer academic experience. So again, struggling with their studies, finding it hard to do their assignments, finding lectures difficult. Those things was found all much more hard for this group. And then finally, the social experiences. Here we saw that those who didn't complete had significantly lower social identification. So that's, identifying with other students, feeling like, oh, I identify as being a University of Glasgow student. But then also lower organisational identity, so that maybe the more sense of broader community and belonging within the university. These students who had dropped out didn't feel that they really belonged at their university in comparison to the two other groups. Then what I did was I did an analysis where I matched 40 of the people who had dropped out to 40 of the people who had graduated on age and gender and country of study, so controlling for those characteristics. And here I tried to see which factor might be the best one at predicting whether or not someone graduates. And here the only factor that came out as significant was that experience of the transition. So suggesting that there's maybe something quite important about that transition. And unfortunately, because of the small sample size, I wasn't able to look in terms of interactions between variables. But you might predict that, there are knock-on effects of having a negative transition experience. It might then affect you accessing support. It might affect your socialising aspects because you're not feeling that you're fitting in and so on. So I think future research is definitely needed with larger samples and looking at how these factors might all interrelate. So as I mentioned, there were two phases to this research. The second phase was our qualitative aspect, and here I did semi-structured interviews with 14 autistic people. And this study was participatory, so I worked with an autistic guy who himself had dropped out of uni to design the research. So we worked together on all aspects of the research in terms of, everything from writing the questions together to analysing the themes together, and then we've written up the paper together as well, which was accepted today for publication. Woo. But in terms of what we found, so we've kind of organised the themes into these three different areas. So firstly, there were a number of systemic issues that participants talked about. And these systemic issues, they operate in their everyday lives, but were sort of made worse at university. So firstly, there was things around accessing diagnosis. Now, a lot of people in the sample were late diagnosed, so they hadn't actually been diagnosed when they were at university. Now, I can't say if that was just a recruitment bias, or maybe if you're late diagnosed, you're at higher risk of dropping out. We're not able to say that. But for this group of participants, many of them talked about how they wished they had known that they were autistic at the time, and how they believed that if they'd just known, maybe things would have been different. Maybe they would have had more access to support. Although, unfortunately, for the people who were diagnosed at uni, they did say that I was diagnosed, but I didn't get the support that I needed. So it's not necessarily the case that if you have a diagnosis, you get the support you need, unfortunately. And sort of linking to this was the lack of autism understanding that they talked about in the general population, and then within staff and other students, and how this really impacted on their experiences, because if people don't understand autism, it can just make everyday life more challenging because you face maybe more stigma, or people with many stereotypes, so that just made their everyday life harder. A lot talked about their mental health and how when they were at university, many of them had had pre-existing mental health problems, but university made it all much worse for various different reasons. And linked to this was this feeling of being an outsider. And again, this is not something that necessarily is just within university. Like, a lot of autistic people talk about feeling like they are on the outside looking in social situations. And they often really, really try to get involved in social things, but still just feel like they're this outsider. So all of these systemic issues influenced and had an impact on their time at university. So when they started talking about the different challenges they'd experienced at university, one of the main themes was around culture shock in relation to managing independent life and independent study. Because when you first go to university, it is a bit of a culture shock. You know, suddenly you're expected to be an adult and to do things independently, and often you're just really left to your own devices. And so within this, we had 3 sub-themes. So something around expectations. You know, at university, firstly, there's often the expectation that this will be the best time of your life. It's going to be brilliant. And then a lot of these people felt that those expectations weren't being met. And then there was the sensory elements people talked about. So they really felt like campus was not compatible with them because there was too much noise, there was too much movement around, and that just became too overwhelming for too many of them. And especially for those who lived in halls, they talked about how student halls were just the worst sensory place on earth. And then finally, the third sub-theme there was around the need for structure. So we know that an autistic characteristic relates to a preference for structure and routine. And I think with university, like I mentioned, often it doesn't have that explicit structure. And they really felt that impacted on their ability to study and so forth, because they just didn't know where to start without clear set structure. So following the culture shock aspects, people talked about becoming disengaged and how their motivation dropped off because they couldn't deal with everything that was going on. They felt it was too much, and so they just stepped back from it. They didn't start to submit coursework. They maybe didn't go along to lectures anymore. And then in terms of talking about support, there was a real lack of proactive support. So these students, when they were at uni, they didn't know who could have helped them. And if they did go to talk to someone about the help they needed, often they found that those people were not helpful, maybe turned them away, a bit dismissive. And then they also didn't know what could have helped them at the time. Like, often we can't expect our students to know what would help them. We should really be going to them with clear support options rather than expecting them to know what they need. And then finally, after all these things kind of interacted together, we have the theme of dropping out becoming the only option or becoming inevitable. Unfortunately, once all these things had happened, especially with aspects of not submitting coursework or not going to exams, there does become an unfortunate inevitability that the university often told some of the participants that they couldn't continue their studies because they hadn't submitted work, they hadn't done the exams. And so things often were almost out of their control, and they just accepted that and decided to drop out. We also talked about life after dropping out, and here a lot of people talked about the trauma and the shame that they had associated with that time in their life. Because dropping out of university, it can be something that's quite stigmatised, and for many people they're then left with this period of their life and their CVs where they have to try and explain that to employers and so on, and many just found it really difficult to process and just felt ashamed of that period of their life. But positively, a lot of these participants had managed to kind of work through a lot of that trauma and talked about, on reflection, they had done the right thing by dropping out because they maybe hadn't had the right mental health at the time, they hadn't had the right support in place, so they really felt like actually it was the best thing at the time that they should have done, and that they were advising other autistic people that you really just have to do what's right for you in your own personal situation. But as one of the participants said, it was pretty much the worst period of my life, really. For me, that was rock bottom. So I think, always bearing that in mind, that we hope as lecturers or other teaching staff, that we hope that our students have the best time, but unfortunately not everyone does, and we have to acknowledge that and think of ways of preventing them feeling this way. So in terms of interpretation of these two studies, they kind of indicate that perhaps some support with the transition to university would be beneficial, but there's always that element of some of those systemic issues I talked about. And if you're late diagnosed, how can we identify the people who need support? So really what you need is better support for everyone transitioning to university. You shouldn't need to have a diagnosis to get good support to uni. And when you're at university, the support that's available needs to be very accessible and clear. And our participants in the qualitative study talked about the need for one clear centralised contact, so that they've got someone who can help them when they're struggling, or at least just help them direct to the appropriate source of support. And as I mentioned, there are lots of different systemic issues, but these don't necessarily operate just within university. I think, we need a lot of societal level change as well to ensure that autistic people are accepted generally and feel included and able to achieve whatever they wish within higher education in this context, but beyond as well. And as well, that trauma, making sure we do everything we can to prevent the experience being traumatic. For some people, dropping out might be the right thing, or interrupting their studies, it might be what they need to do. But we need to make sure that any feelings of trauma are reduced as much as possible. And as someone in the study said, don't blame yourself if dropping out does happen. There are so many reasons university doesn't work out for someone, and some of them are very flexible with time, experience, and more support. So there is hope. Okay, so that's the findings from my recent work looking at university dropout. I'm now going to talk a wee bit about my research on camouflaging. So when I talk about camouflaging, you might have heard this term before, but what it is about masking or passing or hiding autistic characteristics. And so trying to get through social situations in particular. And it might involve strategies like learning social scripts, so that when you have a conversation with someone, you can go, okay, these are things I can talk about with that person. It might involve forcing yourself to have eye contact or copying the gestures of other people. Now, unfortunately, what we see in autism is that this camouflaging has quite consistently been linked with poorer well-being. Now, I think a lot of us, non-autistic as well, do kind of camouflage in certain situations to kind of get by. Like if you're doing a talk, you're going to put on some kind of act to make sure you display your best self. But for autistic people, there's a point at which this camouflaging becomes detrimental and has a negative impact on their mental well-being. There's also a lot of speculation around gender differences in camouflaging. So you might hypothesize, because autistic women are more likely to be diagnosed later in life, perhaps that means they're better at camouflaging. But actually, the findings on gender differences in camouflaging are a bit mixed. Some studies finding a gender difference with autistic women reporting more camouflaging, and other studies not. And actually, a lot of autistic men do report that they do camouflage. So this current study, we were interested in a couple of key questions related to the gender differences and related to well-being. So first of all, we wanted to look at the gender aspect and more in terms of whether there might be different reasons for camouflaging for autistic women versus autistic men. And secondly, we're quite interested to know what happens if someone camouflages in some situations but not in others. Because anecdotally, autistic people talk about putting the mask on and off, and in different situations, masking and then not doing it. But no one had really looked at to see what the effects might be of this switching between masking or camouflaging and not. Because you might hypothesize that lots of switching could have an effect on your mental health. So, in this study, we had 262 autistic adults, around half female, and in this questionnaire, there were a number of questions. Firstly, they were answering, we gave them a set of 21 different possible reasons for camouflaging. And these were all developed with autistic adults and in reviewing the literature. And so they rated the different reasons and had to say how much they agreed they were reasons for camouflaging. I camouflage to get by in everyday work situations. I camouflage to get along with my friends. With these reasons, what we did was we then did some factor analysis and identified 2 broad areas of reasons, which we called conventional reasons. So those are reasons to get by within educational or workplace sort of settings, more formal kind of areas. And then relational reasons were camouflaging to get by within your kind of more personal relations with people, like with family or with friends. We also then looked at possible contexts for camouflaging. So here, again, they had to say how often they had camouflaged in the different contexts. So like in a job interview or when meeting friends. Here again, we did a similar analysis and identified 2 broad areas. So formal context, so again, that would be something like a job interview. Interpersonal context would be in terms of friendships. And here what we then did was classify people in 3 different groups. So our low camouflagers, they reported low rates of camouflaging in both formal and interpersonal contexts. Our switchers reported a high rate of camouflaging in one context and a low rate in the other. And then the high camouflagers say that they do high camouflaging in both contexts. And then finally, everyone completed the depression, anxiety, and stress scale to get a measure of their kind of mental health symptoms. Okay, so in terms of whether camouflaging happens for different reasons for men and women, so for the conventional reasons, so getting by in the workplace or in educational settings, both men and women report that they do camouflage more in this setting than in the relational kind of reasons. However, autistic women were much more likely to endorse those conventional reasons than men were, so suggesting there might be some gender difference there. Then in terms of camouflaging and switching, here, so we looked at how these 3 different groups might relate to the different symptoms. So with depression, there were no differences between the 3 groups. But for anxiety, here we see a significant difference just between the low camouflagers and the high camouflagers. And then for stress, we see that both the switchers and the high camouflagers reported significantly higher stress levels. So what do these findings mean? So autistic women were endorsing those conventional reasons more. So trying to get by in those kind of conventional, everyday, formal kind of interactions. So we related this a bit to intersectionality. So that's the idea of having multiple identities. So an autistic woman, they have to navigate not only being autistic, but being an autistic woman as well. And intersectionality talks about how, for autistic women, they're faced with a very male-dominated narrative about autism. Everything we know about autism is developed based on men. And for autistic women, that could mean there are many misperceptions about autism, and in everyday life, in the workplace or in education, they might feel they need to camouflage more to counter some of these stereotypes and misunderstandings people have about autism in women. And we also saw that switching in different situations seems to be particularly detrimental in terms of stress. And this might make sense in terms of thinking of it as stressful to be kind of tracking your identity and who you are in these different scenarios. But unfortunately what we see is people who do that camouflaging all the time, that is both stressful and anxiety-provoking. So there's quite a lot of research coming out on camouflaging, and I know others are very much interested in it too here at Glasgow. And I think there's still much more we can do to understand why is it having such an impact, and what can we do to stop it having such an impact on people? And unfortunately, part of this research I've not mentioned on my slides, but we also had a qualitative element, and a lot of people talked about the fact that they camouflage to protect themselves against discrimination and bullying. So there's a payoff there. You either camouflage and it affects your mental health, or you don't camouflage and you're discriminated against or you're bullied and that affects your mental health. So it's a kind of lose-lose situation. So in terms of the universities, we need to think of how can we make sure that autistic students don't feel that they need to camouflage. We have to make sure they have safe spaces where they can safely take the mask off. Okay, so in terms of the first impressions research, so you might have heard of first impressions. So when you first meet someone, we very rapidly make judgments about them. And Noah Sasson and colleagues have done quite a cool study where they're looking at the first impressions formed of autistic people. And what they found was that non-autistic observers tend to make more negative judgments of autistic people. And here they don't know, because they're rating stimuli here, they don't know that the people in the stimuli, that some of them are autistic. And yet they still rate the autistic people more negatively. Now, the problem with Sasson et al.'s study was that they only had 3 females in their stimuli. And we wanted to see whether gender might actually influence the first impressions people form. And so what we did was we replicated Sasson's study and had new stimuli where we had 10 autistic women, 10 autistic men, 10 non-autistic women, and 10 non-autistic men. And these were all matched on age and IQ. So what our non-autistic adults do is they view these video clips, and in the video clips it's literally 10 seconds, and we've asked the stimuli participants to talk about their kind of dream job. So it might be someone saying something, oh, I'm really passionate about working with animals. And the non-autistic observers have to just rate, how likable they think the person is, how much they would like to hang out with them, those kind of things. Okay, so overall, we replicated Sasson et al.'s finding of seeing that there was this group effect with autistic people rated more negatively than non-autistic people. And then, looking at the gender-based judgments, there were a number of different interactions here, but non-autistic females were rated more positively than autistic females for 10 out of 11 traits. Non-autistic males were also rated more positively than autistic males for 10 out of 11 traits. Autistic females were rated more positively than autistic males, so within the diagnostic category, we see the difference as well. And then again, non-autistic females are rated more positively than non-autistic males. So again, within the diagnostic group being non-autistic, females are rated more positively there. What was really interesting was that in terms of kind of the sizes of the effects, there were bigger differences between especially the non-autistic females compared to the autistic females. So some of the biggest effect sizes with those comparisons. So that was really interesting to see such huge differences between the non-autistic and autistic females. Because we were thinking that the bigger differences would be between males and females, but it was actually within gender. So we kind of confirmed that within the autism, within first impressions of autism, the gender of the person you're evaluating does matter and does have an influence. So this might relate to something around what we talk about as a female protective effect in the paper. So we saw there that non-autistic females are rated more positively than non-autistic males. So perhaps it's just something about presenting as female, you're rated more positively. Now what's interesting, because we might have hypothesized that maybe the autistic females were camouflaging. Hence, maybe that's why we had originally protected that the differences wouldn't be so big with autistic females and non-autistic females. But what our findings suggest is that even if these participants were camouflaging, non-autistic people were still able to detect social differences. So perhaps camouflaging strategies don't necessarily work that well. And I think in terms of thinking about implications, it kind of implies that, unsurprisingly, clinicians, for example, when diagnosing autism, like a GP, if someone goes to the GP inquiring about an autism diagnosis, if they're a woman, they might be more likely to be turned away, and that does tend to happen. But some of these kind of biases might be playing a role there. And as well, I think as staff, if we're staff, or just other students interacting with new students, thinking about how these kind of first impressions might impact on our willingness to interact. Because, there's this idea that you never get a second chance to make another great first impression. But actually, it's not all down to the person making the impression. You also have a role yourself as the person who's doing the judging. So, in terms of the key points, just to reiterate, so autistic people are at higher risk of dropping out, and it looks like this could be related to things around the transition, around lack of support, and especially in terms of the academic study, and also problems with fitting into the wider community. There are also a number of systemic issues which, as I've said, don't just impact at university level, but throughout everyday lives, and of all ages for autistic people. Also, the camouflaging aspects will affect everyday life for both autistic men and women. And we need to think about, as a university, what can the universities do to make autistic people feel that they don't need to camouflage. And also, we see that those gender-based judgments are made in terms of first impressions, and again, how this might impact on our interactions with students. So, in terms of actual take-home implications, what we really need to see is more evidence-based support for our students when they're first coming to university. So the University of Bath have been developing some really good transition programs where they give, I think they're mostly school students, they give them a kind of taster of university of life where they literally come for a week and have like little taster lectures, they get to see around campus, get some talks about daily living skills and these kind of things. And I think they found that generally these transition programs are showing good potential, but they've only been looked at really in the short term. It would be good to see how these transition supports, how well they impact longer term outcomes, do they help prevent students dropping out and that sort of thing. And I think, and in my ideal world, every member of staff would be trained about autism. We often have to do, we have to do training about GDPR, fire safety, but it would be really nice to have a little bit of online training about autism as well, because a lot of autistic people, not just in this research, but in my other research, talk about the lack of acceptance they experience every day, and how this really impacts on their mental health and their well-being. So we can start at a university level by thinking about what training would benefit staff so that staff are accepting. As well, I think, a lot of us are personal tutors, and it's always helpful, not just for our autistic students, for all students, that we are approachable and knowledgeable, because, we're not going to be able to answer every question or know absolutely everything, but we should hopefully be able to direct our students to the appropriate support. And I think for autistic students, they talked about really wanting to know who I can contact, and then knowing that that person is your advocate as well, that they know you don't have to explain to numerous different people what issues you have. That person just gets you and knows how to help you. And in terms of the camouflaging stuff, I just think it's so important that we think about how can we make sure our students who are autistic, how can we make them feel that they can be themselves? Because we don't want autistic people to go around thinking that they have to pretend to be non-autistic people. That's not what we want. And what's interesting is Noah Sasson has done some further work on this first impressions research, and they found that adding a diagnostic label improves those first impressions. So it suggests that disclosure of being autistic is helpful to make people a bit more understanding and form better first impressions. But obviously there's the challenges there of being late diagnosed. And the general fact, again, we can't expect everyone will want to disclose if they're autistic. So we need to make sure university is accessible for everyone, and that you don't need to have a diagnosis, and you don't need to have to disclose in order to get support or feel that you're accepted. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you to all of these lovely people who I've worked with. If you're interested in any of my papers, I have got copies if you would like. I'm on Twitter, but thank you very much, and I welcome any questions you might have.